It occurs to me that this video will probably confuse a lot of people. Just stick with me to the end, and I think you'll understand where I'm coming from. So I think enough time has elapsed that I can finally talk about Avengers Endgame spoilers. I mean, practically every other channel on the internet didn't even wait until the movie had been out for a day before they started getting into it, but I chose to be restrained and let at least as many of you as possible get into the theater to see it for yourselves. I'm guessing that at this point you've either seen it or you've already seen the spoilers and thus don't care anymore, but either way, spoilers from here on out for Avengers Endgame and pretty much the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe. Now, you may recall that I said in my original Endgame review that I enjoyed the movie. I found it to be a very satisfying conclusion. But at the same time, I also said that it was clearly an emotionally driven film. That's what it was really relying on to work. And if you try to actually think about it, the whole thing completely falls apart. And I've had plenty of time to think about it at this point, and I realize it's actually kind of bizarre that I like it, and that so many people around the world like it. The movie is basically counting on the audience being emotionally invested at this point. After 10 years, it is playing entirely to that pathos idea. Because when you look at it from a logical perspective, well, Avengers Endgame could very well be a contender for the worst film of 2019 if you just look at it separate from the emotions. Because there is oh so very much that this movie does that's just not good storytelling. And I'm just gonna go through the list right now. So again, remember that I actually did like this movie well enough, but I'm still gonna rip into it for a little bit right now. It's come to my attention through reading the comments that a lot of people expected me to not like this movie because of its time travel plot, which is weird to me because I've only reviewed one movie to date at this point that has a bad time travel plot that I really ripped into, that being Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah. And I guess once was all it took to convince people that I must have a problem with time travel movies. I don't, by the way. Time travel stories I am not automatically opposed to. They always have plot holes because that just comes with time travel. I am convinced at this point that if you're telling a story that involves time travel, you cannot avoid plot holes, no matter how hard you try. It's impossible. You're always going to create some kind of paradox or something that doesn't reconcile by the end. But if you still tell a good story, you may have earned the right for the audience to overlook that. Well, I don't necessarily know if Endgame did that, outside of its emotional stakes. The long and the short of it is that Avengers Endgame only has rules for time travel when it's convenient to the plot. First, they set up this convoluted reason why going back in time and messing with the past doesn't actually change the timeline, which I'm not even sure the writers understood what they were saying when they wrote all of that down. It makes no sense at all. It's convoluted and ridiculous. But then, when they're actually in the past, it turns out you can kind of mess with the timeline and have some sort of effect. It's more that instead of changing your timeline, it creates a divergent timeline based on whatever you changed. And it's a timeline that runs parallel to your own, so it will not interfere with your timeline. But then at the very end, Steve Rogers goes back in time to put back everything that they had stolen or borrowed or whatever term you choose. And he doesn't come back. He stays in the past to live his life with Peggy Carter, which conflicts, messes with the past, and creates that divergent timeline. Yet there he is at the very end as an old man just waiting for them to notice him as he sits by the lakeshore. What's he doing there? Shouldn't he be in a divergent timeline? Because we know he didn't. Why is he there? How did he get there? He didn't come through the time machine. And if he's a Steve Rogers from a different reality, which he isn't, by the way, because it's very clearly that same guy. That much is made explicit. But just if we entertain the possibility he's from another timeline, how did he get there? You see how that part doesn't make any sense? It's emotional because we finally get to see Steve and Peggy together, and they get that dance that they had wanted since the first movie, but it doesn't make sense how they got there. I also mentioned how I felt the movie had a lot of respect for its characters, especially those Phase 1 heroes we've been with from the beginning. I have to revise that a little because the more I think about it, the more I realize that respect is not applicable when it comes to Thor. They just completely butchered him here. Before you say anything, I get what they were going for. I really do. People deal with failure in different ways. Thor dealt with it by just giving up entirely, letting himself go, becoming a bit of a slob. I get it. I understand what they were doing, and I understand why he in particular would go that route, because he was the one who could have ended it, or at least he's perceiving it that way, and he was unable to. He could have dealt the final blow, if you will. Just because I get it, though, doesn't mean I think it works. In execution, it just wound up playing in a way that makes Thor a laughingstock, and yet again undoes everything, literally everything, that was set up in Thor Ragnarok. It's as if the Russo brothers had this personal vendetta against that movie because they spent 2 movies completely undoing all the things that Ragnarok set up. By the end of Endgame, Thor is no longer king. His powers are all but forgotten. Yet again, I have to ask, what was the point of Thor Ragnarok? If you're gonna set up all this stuff so that Thor is finally in a position where he can be the king, and he will lead his people, and he has all of these incredible powers now that he doesn't even need a tool for, and then you get him to this point where he does need tools and his powers are all but forgotten, and he abdicates the throne too. He gives it to Valkyrie for some reason because he says she's a leader, unlike him, the guy who, when he met failure, locked himself away and let himself go by drinking himself into a stupor. Even though Valkyrie, when met with failure, locked herself away and let herself go by drinking herself into a stupor, which was clearly established in Thor Ragnarok. So why is she a better choice? Why is she suddenly a better choice for a leader than him? That made, again, it makes no sense. It feels... It doesn't feel like that was really earned. It feels like they were just ignoring Thor Ragnarok, which I guess they must have really not liked that movie. And while we're on the subject of character progression, the Hulk. Again, I get what they were going for, and I'm not opposed to the idea of Bruce Banner and the Hulk finally becoming one entity, getting past all of their problems, and finding that common ground, and achieving that sort of peace, and finally getting to live a good life. But you know what I feel cheated by? The fact that we didn't actually see it. When we left off at the end of Infinity War, there was no indication at all that this was the direction Banner and the Hulk would be going. And you could have made an entire movie just about those two characters finally reconciling their differences. But instead we just see the end result of that story. And I think we all wanted to see it. We've all been kind of hoping we'd get a Hulk movie again at some point, because at this point we only have 2 of them. One which isn't technically canon. I mean, it kind of is, but kind of isn't. That's the Eric Bana one that Ang Lee directed. And there's the Edward Norton one that nobody cares about. I mean, a Hulk movie led by Mark Ruffalo would have been good, especially if we got to see that story. But now we only see the end result, and that leaves the question of, why bother keeping the Hulk around? He's one of the few Phase 1 heroes who's still around at the end, but why even bother? He has no conflicts left. The entire point of the Hulk's character is that it's the man versus self idea. Bruce Banner and the Hulk are in a constant struggle for control. They're constantly butting heads with themselves, even though they are the same person technically, while also trying to outrun a world that hates them. Now, they've found common ground and become one whole being, and everybody loves them. And they don't seem to have any problems anymore. There are no more interesting stories you can tell with the Hulk at the center. At best, he'll be a supporting role from this point forward, if he still bothers showing up. That, by the way, is one of the examples of the show don't tell rule being broken that I mentioned in the original review. I also have to ask the question of what makes the Infinity Gauntlet special. I mean, the first movie made it a point of saying that only the dwarves could forge certain things. Only they could forge weapons like Mjolnir and Stormbreaker, and only they could make a device capable of wielding all the Infinity Stones at once. And even then, it'll still do a number on you when you use it. But then Tony Stark just modifies an Iron Man glove for it. And yeah, it can still do a number on you, but nevertheless, it's still able to use the Infinity Stones. So, kind of makes you wonder why they didn't just try this sort of thing in the first place. I don't know, that's one of those things that just kind of feels like they really were making this up as they went along. And I would be remiss if I did not address the elephant in the room, which is the lie of Captain Marvel. People were saying that Captain Marvel was the movie you had to see if you wanted to understand Endgame. They were saying she was the most powerful hero in the whole Marvel universe, who could take out Thanos in one blow if she wanted to. And then we actually get to Endgame, and not only is she barely in the movie, but Thanos takes her out in one punch. And her presence just felt really shoehorned in. You could cut her from this movie. She has no reason to be there. What does she contribute? Answer me that. What does she contribute? Getting Tony Stark and Nebula to Earth? They could have done that any other way. There are all sorts of different ways you could write that scene that allows them to get to Earth while still creating a sense of drama and tension. It didn't have to be Captain Marvel. And after that, gravy. She has no purpose being there. It was just not necessary. And one last thing that bothers me is the way in which Gamora was brought back. Because I'm assuming she's here to stay now. And, well, basically all of her character development from the last two movies chucked right out the window. She has been reset to square one in every conceivable way, and as a result, I'm kind of worried about how Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 will turn out. Because now it has to somehow work around that. It has to work around the fact that all that work that James Gunn put into realizing Gamora's character and her relationship with the other characters, down the toilet. All of it. That's not a small thing for a writer to deal with. And, well, I am kind of anticipating problems as a result. And right about now, I am guessing that, as I predicted at the start, a lot of you are probably confused right now, assuming you've still stuck around this long and haven't tuned out by this point. You're probably thinking, I thought he said he liked the movie. Why has he spent so much time ripping into it? Well, like I said, the reason Avengers Endgame works is because of that emotional core. It's counting on the idea that you have been invested in these characters for over a decade, and therefore anything that happens to them, anything they do, any moment they have, is really going to matter to you, whether or not it actually makes sense. And I cannot deny that it worked, at least to a certain degree. Yeah, I liked seeing Captain America get to wield Thor's hammer, or I liked seeing Iron Man be the one who finally saves the day by making the ultimate sacrifice. All of those things. There were great moments in there. But it all hinges on the emotion. Without the emotional buildup of 10 years following these characters, getting attached to them, seeing them grow, seeing them fight and reconcile, the movie would not have worked at all. Is it manipulation? Yes it is. But it worked. And it can never happen again. I think this really is the pinnacle. Marvel will never be able to repeat what they have done with Avengers Endgame. With everything I've said up to this point that's positive and negative regarding the movie, I still ultimately feel like this was the best possible conclusion we could have gotten to the MCU. Except it's not the conclusion. We already know that things are going to continue after this. In fact, recently, as of this video's posting, the next trailer for Spider-Man Far From Home was released. And that confirms that Far From Home takes place after Endgame. Yeah, apparently everyone in Peter Parker's class got dusted, and they're all just going to continue as if nothing ever happened. That seemed pretty clear to me when Spider-Man started talking to Tony Stark at the end of Endgame and was acting as if he just blacked out for a few seconds. But as a bonus, now Parker is working with Nick Fury and S.H.I.E.L.D. You know, the guy who everyone believes is dead and the organization everyone believes was dissolved. So it's as if Winter Soldier never happened either, but that's a whole different can of worms. It's clear that Marvel has no intention of stopping this series anytime soon, and they have a whole big plan set up for at least the next 5 or 10 years. And I think that's a mistake, because if this is how they're going to continue things, well, honestly, Endgame felt like such a definitive conclusion that I don't see how they could possibly continue. It's not just the problem of finding a villain, although that is a big part of it. Yes, you need to find someone who is an equal threat to Thanos and build him up. But then again, how do you do that? It's not like Thanos is even the only villain who's tried rewriting the entire universe in a single instant. He was beaten to the punch by Malekith and the Dark Elves in Thor the Dark World, and then by Ego in Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. And you know what? I was far more emotionally invested in Ego than I ever was in Thanos. But then again, Ego and the Dark Elves were one-off villains. Thanos was only separated from them by the fact that he was built up steadily by cameo appearances and post-credit stingers over these past few years. So how do you come up with a new villain who can match that? I've heard some people say Kang the Conqueror, who, if I'm remembering correctly, is a time traveler? But then again, we just spent an entire movie establishing that time travel has no rules unless the plot needs it to have rules. So, good luck making that work if that's the route they go. But it's not just finding a good villain. It's giving us heroes that we will be as connected to as we were to those Phase 1 heroes. That's the key, really, because the heroes are the ones we'll be following consistently. And based on Marvel's current plan, I don't think they have the best setup going forward. The hero they want leading the way for these next few years is Captain Marvel, a character who is divisive. No politics, no taking sides from me. You just cannot deny the objective fact that Captain Marvel is a divisive character. Technically, she was divisive back before she even made it into the films, when she was just in the comics. But ever since the movies came out, it's only gotten worse. Captain Marvel is the character who broke the fan base. Unlike with Robert Downey Jr. as Tony Stark in Iron Man, who everyone instantly loved, Captain Marvel has everyone split. Some people like her, some people don't like her, and there are extremes on both of those camps. I've yet to see anyone who can really say they feel just moderately about her. And then again, this is the internet. Moderate views don't really exist here. But still, that means Marvel is starting fresh with a severe handicap. Again, look at how things started in Phase 1. Robert Downey Jr. as Tony Stark, everyone instantly loved him. Chris Evans as Captain America, everyone instantly believed it. Chris Hemsworth as Thor, maybe didn't have the strongest opening, but people still were drawn to him. Edward Norton as the Hulk, well, you can't win them all. But nevertheless, when he was replaced by Mark Ruffalo, people got used to him and liked him too. And now, the character Marvel wants leading the charge is Captain Marvel, played by Brie Larson. And there is a lot of controversy surrounding both of them. And their backup is Black Panther, a character who also got swept up in a lot of controversy. Not the best game plan. Then again, maybe it's not a total wash. I mean, they still do have Spider-Man, though even those movies aren't necessarily grabbing people the way they used to. They still have the Guardians of the Galaxy, though, admittedly, like I said, they have a big problem they have to work through now. And they still have Ant-Man, which has to overcome the fact that the next movie will be an Ant-Man movie. I mean, those are fine, but they've never been the height of the MCU. And this is all after they've given us such a definitive end to the story. Talk about an uphill battle in the rain. I've noticed quite a few people saying they're done with the MCU after Endgame. Whether they liked it or not, even people who like it have been saying they feel like they're ready to put the MCU behind them and not move forward with it. And I've got to be honest, I'm one of them. I really don't have any desire to see Spider-Man Far From Home, and given how Endgame really did feel like the end of the story, I just don't know if it'll be able to pick up after that. It's not easy. I, of course, am not done with superheroes as a whole. DC's been hitting it out of the park recently. And, of course, there are other non-MCU works that are coming out, which I'm interested in. A good sequel to Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse? I'd be up for that. If it's good, of course. I'm hoping that wasn't a lightning in the bottle sort of scenario. It's just the MCU itself. I feel as if I'm ready to close the book on that particular chapter and just put it behind me. And as for Endgame itself, I still found it to be satisfying enough, but it's not going to take much to top it. I can already tell you that Shazam and Alita Battle Angel far surpass it on my list of best movies of 2019. And the hope is that Godzilla King of the Monsters will be the next film to do that sort of thing. Endgame itself is just sort of okay in my book. It's possible that could change. The MCU is apparently taking a break in the year 2020, and maybe that'll be long enough for me to recuperate, and by the time I see the next trailer for whatever project they're working on, I'll go, yeah, I'll check that out. But at this point, I'm just ready to say the MCU is done, and it was quite a journey. And that's where I'm ready to leave it. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like it, as well as subscribe to the channel for more content of a similar nature. Also, check the description for links to our Twitter, DeviantArt, and Patreon pages, as well as the Amazon link for the novel Operation Red Dragon: The Daikaiju Wars Part 1, penned by yours truly. Thank you all, and we appreciate your support.